lot of time there. So there are many levels to this narrative, and I don't know if I can bring them all together and weave them into one coherent whole. Much of it has to do with thank yous, because it involves a lineage of writers that have been here in this area for a long time. Some I've known, some have passed. I'm kind of honored to have this connected to the regional special collections, such as Eva Greensill Anderson, who probably a few of you know, but she was an educator and a member of the House of Representatives many years ago, and she wrote books, and I recently discovered that she wrote young adult fiction, and so I have still books to come as I pursue her works. I'm pleased to speak in the Commons because as a donor, really it's a multi-tiered honor to share an aspect of myself, to be recognized as an archivist, and to highlight this lineage of writers that have a strong connection to Ellensburg and the environs. I will begin with an epigram by the poet Jack Spicer from his poem, A Fake Novel About the Life of Arthur Rimbaud. You can't close the door. It's in the future, French history said, as it was born in Charleville. This was before the Civil War, and I don't believe even James Buchanan was president yet. This is a mysterious epigram because an archive, by its very nature, is mysterious. For most people, an archive contains things that are saved because they are rare or unique, or that an archive is but a repository for historical documents, and they think no more about it. But an archive is really a hedge against the collapse of civilization, against personal oblivion, if you may. According to Jampa Control, Tibetan scholar who I'm connected with because he wrote the retreat manual for my 3-year Tibetan retreat, when Atisha, an 11th century scholar, came to Tibet, he was amazed at how widely Vajrayana Buddhism had spread in Tibet. It had been very much lost in India due to various wars and catastrophes. We owe a debt to Averroes, a 12th century Islamic philosopher who wrote commentaries on Aristotle, which later, by rediscovering Aristotle's works, were to lay the foundation for much of modern philosophy and scientific inquiry. According to Thomas Cahill, author of How the Irish Saved Civilization, everyone owes a debt of gratitude to the Irish monks of the 5th century. That's around the time of St. Patrick, because they stored the written record of civilization during this time of conflict, plunder, anarchy. Fictionally, in A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller, there's a group of Catholic monks that live in a monastery sort of in the southwest. I think right down below Echo Canyon. There's a little road that goes out there. Who knows? But at any rate, over many centuries, they kept the records of civilization until the philosophers could grok it again. I mean, here, think Magister Ludi, the glass bead game. Just a reference, you kids write it down. There is, of course, no guarantee that there is a future on this planet for us. I mean, there's no icon labeled P for posterity that you can push. And presently, we're in an era of self-archivization. But if the electronic grid should collapse, well, the cloud would dissipate. And the intricacies of this digital archive are way beyond my capacity to elucidate. But the main task of developing an archive of any archive begs similar questions. Where does it begin, and where does it end? And what's to be included, and what's to be left out? So here, let me begin with the idea for my High Mountain Valley collection. The idea came to me following the death of Mark Halperin, a close friend. We taught creative writing here at Central for many years. And I checked in the archive to see if his works were in the special collection. Only his early works were there, and some works by other authors that I knew. I noticed 2 library-bound editions of copies of Vagabond, an anthology of poets and story writers edited by John Bennett, a courageous underground mag of the 60s and 70s, even ran into the 80s, during the small press wars of the mid-60s, the magazine wars they were known as. There were some of my self-published works in the collection, but there were no copies of the Ellensburg anthology. This anthology of local poets and writers was initially sponsored by the Ellensburg Art Commission, a commission that later morphed into the Ellensburg, it was the Arts Festival Committee that later morphed into the Ellensburg Art Commission. Sometimes this anthology was subsidized by a Washington State Arts grant, much against its outlaw nature. I looked for a copy of Dick Johnson's Then King Came Down, a novel I read after my family and I moved from Alaska to Kittitas County in 1974 so that I could run a 800-acre cattle ranch out by Badger Pocket. But I saw neither hide nor hair of this book. I thought it might be interesting to round up and corral a collection of these little doggies. The title of my collection comes from a chapbook of the period, which I will dub the Ellensburg Renaissance. Anarchist Murmurs from a High Mountain Valley by John Bennett, circa 1972. It was one of the first chapbooks that John published when he landed here in Ellensburg. Dick Elliott, in the role of Coyote, told him it was a high mountain valley. Thanks goes to Paula McMinn for unearthing specimens of Ellensburg public school writing, to Rolf Williams for connecting me via internet with local authors who sell their books at Gerald's, to Daniel and Debbie at Brick Road Books on Main Street, to the many writers in the humanities departments at Central who donated copies of their works, to Julie Prather and Jane Orlman, who opened their libraries and presented me with valuable finds, including the holy grail of my search, Then King Came Down. Ella and Marlene Cheney, who has forgiven me, I hope, for incinerating a copy of Gregory Corso's Long Live Man in my microwave during a preservation experiment. Believe me, a burning book in a microwave is a terrible thing to do. There's a story here, but so here's the blurb at the Special Collections website. The High Mountain Valley Local Authors Collection contains a selection of Central Washington's unique and noteworthy literary efforts. It includes examples of various literary forms and genres: novels, poetry, history, philosophy, children's books, romance, science fiction, fantasy, new age, memoir, and essay. The arc of the collection includes examples of academic publishing, mainstream publishing, small edition self-published works, mass paperbacks, print-on-demand books, hardback and softcover underground lit magazines, and art zines. For those keenly interested in exploring the history of books and printing, the collection includes a spectrum of printing techniques: letterpress, offset, photocopying, linoleum, block printing, mimeograph, and calligraphy. These days, I can send a Word file via email to a print-on-demand publisher, say like a Libris, where it will enter a digital template and be run on a production copy, say a Xerox D139, hooked to a Horizon BQ440. Bindery machine, and this will print out a single perfect bound book. And the only time a human hand touches it is when a shipping clerk sticks it into an envelope and mails it to me. And if I carry it up and drop it into the Special Collections and they take it out with white gloves, it'll sit on the shelf and never be touched again. Sounds absurd.
There's a chance.
Yeah, there's a chance that civilization will survive on some level. So beyond preservation, there are two other important aspects to an archive: the authority of the archive and the sequencing of its documents. George, is it provenance? Provenance. The provenance, which is the place of origin of earliest, I asked him because he should ask me.
It's okay.
The place of origin or the earliest known history of a work. And then there's the term respect de fond, all right? A principle in archival theory that proposes to respect the order of a collection of records according to the fonds, which are the groupings, that is to say, according to the way they were received, or at least the way they were created, and this in turn sort of influences the authority of the group. Oh, I've contracted a bad case of archive fever. Man. Books, I must have them. That one. Oh, where did I catch this bug? Well, it was when Julia moved the special collections from the corner room up in the back of the 4th floor to these more spacious digs here on the 2nd floor. And I saw this as an auspicious moment in which to install another archive, a new archive. And also, while browsing on the philosophy section of the library, I came across Jacques Derrida's Archive Fever, a lecture delivered in London in 1994 at Sigmund Freud's house in London when it was being turned into a museum. Derrida is a deconstructionist philosopher, maybe the founder of deconstructionism, and his writings will lead you to consider the nature of an archive, especially the internal contradictions of the Greek word arche, which means both a commencement and a commandment. I mean, this may get... I'm not going to lead you down all these rabbit holes in his quest to analyze the notion of an archive, but I will note that he points out that to archive derives its meaning from the Greek archeon, a residence or of a magistrate, or an archon who, as a commander or a guardian, shields the archive. And this person has political power to interpret the archive. So, like, consider the Supreme Court and the collection of archival constitutional law. And consider the 10 Commandments and the Ark of the Covenant, of the laws handed down by Moses to us. 2 orders of order. Order, sequence, and order, command. Let your brain hold that for a moment. As Lou Garcia says about poetry, the orders come. They are the only issue. There's a double pun. Order and order, and issue. The orders come. They are the only issue. So an archive is both public and private. There's a bell at the door to signal your arrival, and you enter, and you are seated at a table away from the stacks, and you are asked to put on white gloves, sometimes. And the books are brought to you, that much, and you can do your research, but you cannot leave with the books. From the books of my personal collection and those collected with the help of friends who donated books, and by my mining bookstores and the internet, I found a bunch of books, some quite battered. And I put them in alphabetical order, and I signed this collection over to the public at this state university. And at that point, they mystically transubstantiated themselves into both items of reference and reverence. Let me shift from this kind of thinking to discuss some specific books I have collected for this present archive. I wanted there to be breadth and depth to the collection, high art and low, ivory tower poets, street poets, rubbing shoulders, serious and not so serious, fiction and nonfiction, intermingled with scholarly works in this labyrinth of recesses. An archive is like the human mind, and analyzing an archive is a bit like archaeology. This is Derrida again. Some things are on the surface and some things are hidden, and an archivist might come along to a reference to some lost civilization, and perhaps one finds that even the entire universe is an archive. The alphabetical archive begins with Michael Allen, his Western Riverman, 1763 to 1861, Ohio and Mississippi boatman, and the myth of the alligator horse. Well, that was Michael's, I believe, a thesis that he was for his doctorate thesis, but it became a published book by Louisiana State Press in 1990. When I came to town, Michael was going to this school. He talked here not too long ago. This was just a college, and his father was the mayor. And Michael would be here, but instead, he's on the Mississippi doing historical research on the rivermen. So he couldn't get away. There he is. He also wrote a book called Rodeo Cowboys and North American Imagination, University of Nevada Press. Well, if you went to the rodeo this year, you would have heard the announcer talk about how the rodeo is really a folk festival. It brings together all kinds of opposites, such as cowboys and Indians, and ranchers and farmers. It's sort of a one festival gig. That's what he was saying. Oh, that's Michael's thesis, so he must have read Michael's book. So this continues. Well, then there's B. There's Nancy Bacon.
Nice.
A friend of mine gave me an obituary of Nancy Bacon. I would never have known about Nancy Bacon.
Nancy Bacon, and I were classmates.
You were? Okay, so there we go. Well, Nancy Bacon was born about our time, 1940. She just died last year. She was a rodeo queen. And then at underage, she ran away from Ellensburg and went to, well, she went first to she went to Las Vegas, and she got a job as a waitress in the Sands Motel, and she hooked up with a Rat Pack. Right, and then through those connections, she got a job as a B-movie star and a pinup girl, and she wrote self-help books like Legends in Lipstick and Stars in My Bed. Now we can't laugh if there's any Bacons in the audience. I'm in love with Nancy Bacon. She was once asked what was the worst sex she'd ever had. She says, it was terrific. I read a little from one of her books that Julie don't blush. Okay,
Go for it.
And there are more. My scandalous stories of highways. Okay. She also wrote just straightforward romances, and a lot of them translated into Spanish, and so she made a whole life of and died well among her family.
But she didn't write that was Nancy Bacon, right?
As Nancy. Oh, some of them no. I can't remember the other name, but Nancy Bacon's a lot of times. She had a third name too. And she was a tell-all. Well, we have some other tell-alls. These are some of the things that are suppressed in an archive we don't want to know at all. There was Judith Moore. Now, Judith Moore, she grew up in Oklahoma and went to Evergreen, and then she married a well-known dentist that, well, I mean, nameless, but and came here, and she had an affair with an English professor, tall, I don't know, but I won't say. And that was then, but she uses Ellensburg as the whole scene. She wonderfully describes it in her girl Never Eat Your Heart Out, and it is published by Farrar Thoreau. So it's a piece of literature. Actually, her earlier book, A Fat Girl, A True Story, was on the bestseller list. It was a Penguin book. Well. On another angle, there's Jan Kerouac. I mean, you've heard of Kerouac, Jack Kerouac. Well, Jack had a daughter. He didn't want to recognize her, but Jan's mother, the second wife of Jack, lived in Kittitas, and she used to come into my bookstore, and I didn't really know her last name, but she did bring her daughter in once when she was visiting, and well, I don't think I'll go there. She wrote some books, Baby Driver. She lived a much more exciting life than Jack did. Jack was an observer. He even voted for Nixon. And Jan, unfortunately,
the first time or the second time?
Probably both. So some people come here later. Some are born here. For instance, Belle Randall. She wrote a book called 101 Ways of Playing Solitaire. It was a University of Pittsburgh Press book. I think Mark Halperin had that same book, and you know that award that goes with it. She was born here about 1942, and her mother then moved to Berkeley, where I met Belle 20 years later. So she wasn't here long, but then she managed to go to Stanford and study under Stanley Cavell, who was having an affair with her mother. So there's more stories there. Some people were born here and leave, and other people come here late and die. Some people live here all their lives and die. But Alan Nurse is one of my favorites. He came into the bookstore. He was an older man, bearded. He died back in '92. And he was talking about the product. It was like about he was negotiating with Warner Brothers over the title of a movie called Blade Runner. Cult movie. A lot of people have seen that movie. That movie was based on a script by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? But that didn't really seem to be what Ridley wanted for a title. And I think it'd be all right today. But then they didn't really give him credit for that. It actually makes more sense when you understand that Alan Nurse was a doctor, an MD. He taught at the Mayo Clinic, and he had a practice over in North Bend. Came here later in life, but in the 50s, he was up there with Isaac Asimov as one of the great science fiction writers of the golden era of science fiction. And he wrote a lot of novels, kind of for a high school level, about futuristic medicine and computers and things that are kind of like coming true. The Blade Runner was a underground. You'd send off this guy to go scout out some serum and a few, maybe forceps and some blades, some scalpels, so that you could operate on some alien with 9 legs. Not a lot of sex in these stories, really. But he wrote things like Ladies' Home Journal Family Medical Guide, and he wrote on astronomy, and he had his most famous book, I think, was Star Surgeon, which was a scholastic book that had wide circulation. In its day, I think it cost 45 cents, but you've seen those. I mean, they were everywhere. He also wrote a book on sexually transmitted diseases. I looked at it, it was right up to date. He wrote it late, so and it's a very elucidating book because of the way he speaks to the high school. He died in Thorpe. As it regards my work, so should I talk about my work?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, my daughter, Lucian, she told me I should write about the intricacies of my herb before I die, since my mode of writing is counterintuitive. Rather than beginning with a manuscript, I begin with a book. I initiate the writing process by visualizing the completed form the manuscript of my telling will take, and I fill in the empty pages. And over the years, the books have piled up. And the words, they might even mean something. From early on, I collected my poetry, and I published chapbooks under the D Press logo. The D comes from my last name, Denner or Dorje. And it also comes from other associations, like really being depressed. And also depressed. And yeah, depressed. This is depressed. Since the poems reveal my interest, I considered this whole process to be sort of an inner autobiography. And later in life, I've been creating a prose narrative of my adventures. I chose to have these stories told in the third person by a fictional biographer, Bouvard-Pécuchet, whose name is derived from a combination of last names of the two protagonists of Gustave Flaubert's last novel, Bouvard et Pécuchet, a pair of court clerks with intellectual curiosity who delve into all branches of human knowledge with disastrous results. Yeah, combine two idiots and you get an author. As a mid-20th century Bay Area street poet, I'm extensively archived in the Bancroft Library of the University of California, Berkeley. I have 7.5 feet of linear detritus there. But the archive itself runs back to back for 57 miles. So I don't take up that much room. In these confines, I rub shoulders with Shakespeare folios and Aztec codices. Yeah. The Mark Twain collection is there in opulent splendor, and the rumors of Mark Twain's death still circulate. Yeah. Here one might expect some well-deserved rest, but after a brief suspension of time, one hears complaints about wormholes and shelf space. Well, when also some nights you hear table tipping during seances from Madame Sesorsis in the wasteland. Well, and one can also hear some crying and tears in the garden outside, but that'll be then. And this is here and now. Yeah. Derrida says, archive fever is to burn with passion, never to rest, interminably from searching for the archive right where it slips away. It's to run after the archive even if there's too much of it right where something can archivist itself. It's to have compulsive, repetitive, and nostalgic desire for the archive, an irrepressible desire to return to the origin, a homesick nostalgia for a return to the most archaic space of absolute commencement. Yeah, my beginnings and my ends and my beginnings. Before Mark Halpern died, we talked about our works, and he said, it's nice to leave something beautiful behind. Poets have their city muses. Dante had Florence, Baudelaire had Paris, and I have Ellensburg. The formation of the High Mountain Valley Local Authors Collection has been a group endeavor, and the door to the archive is now open.